Okay, this is Mrs. Myers, and this is Unit 3, Lesson 1, talking about polygon congruence. We're going to be talking mostly about congruent triangles in the next unit, but this gives us a general idea about what polygons being congruent actually means. So a polygon is a closed plane figure with at least 3 straight sides and angles. Um, so you know what polygons are. You've got triangles, you've got quadrilaterals, you've got pentagons, hexagons, etc. Okay, those are all polygons. They're all listed here, or some are listed here, I should say. Naming a polygon is actually a very important piece of this lesson. You can name a polygon either clockwise in order or counterclockwise in order. So pick a vertex to start at and then either go clockwise around or counterclockwise. So I give you some examples here. This polygon, it's a hexagon, could be named, start at A and go A, B, C, D, E, F. So it could be called A, B, C, D, E, F. But what if I started at B? If I started at vertex B, then I would just go from there clockwise, B, C, D, E, F, A. If I start at C, I go C, D, E, F, A, B, etc. So you need to fill in the rest of these. I started at A, I started at B, I started at C, now start at D, and then start at E, and then start at F. And just give me what those names would be in order. Sorry, a little cough here. Counterclockwise is an option also, but again, it has to be in order. So in other words, start at F, let's say, we're going to go counterclockwise, E, D, C, B, A. What you don't want to ever do is jump around. You don't want to call it F, C, D, B, A, E. You know, that's just in a random order, and you don't want to call it that. So you could do those two and check your answers. So just pause the video, do them quickly, and then check your answers. Okay, so just make sure if you have a hexagon that you have actually 6 letters naming that hexagon. So there's the answers there. All right, the basic concept here about congruent polygons is if you have two polygons that are exactly the same size and exactly the same shape, they're called congruent. So these two polygons, for example, are congruent quadrilaterals, 4-sided figures, but they're exactly the same. That means the length of each side is the same as the length of a corresponding side on the other polygon. So this is a word we're going to be using a lot with congruent polygons, this word corresponding. So we're talking about, in other words, the part that matches up to whatever given part. So in this case, if I took this polygon and kind of reflected it over and laid it right on top of this one so that one was hiding perfectly behind the other one, which things would match up with each other? Well, they actually have it color-coded here. A would match up with E. They made those both red. B would match up with F, etc. So that means angle A would be congruent to angle E, and angle B would be congruent to angle F, etc. C would be congruent to G, and D would be congruent to H. So those are called corresponding parts. A and E match up, so they're called corresponding angles. Same thing about the sides. Side AB corresponds with side FE. They would be congruent, and they're called corresponding. So you can see there's a congruent statement here saying that the polygons are congruent, and there's congruent statement about the sides, and there's congruent statements about the angles. All of them are corresponding parts. Okay, so that's kind of an important word there, corresponding parts. Here's the key. The order matters when you are writing this congruent statement. Order matters. In other words, when we write this congruent statement, we have to make sure that if I'm going to call this quadrilateral ABCD, then when I name the other quadrilateral in my congruent statement, I need to put it in the order of the corresponding parts. So since I have A first here, and A corresponds with E, remember they're both red, they're congruent, then I have to start with E on the other one. And so everything, if I go clockwise in order, A, B, C, D, if I start at that same corresponding place, E, this one has to go counterclockwise, E, F, G, H. Because you don't want to go clockwise and clockwise, you want to make sure that your parts that are corresponding are in the same spot in your congruent statement. So automatically looking at this, I know C is the third letter, G is the third letter. I know that C and G must correspond to each other because of that. So let's see how that applies down here. So congruent polygons, oh yes, this is a definition which implies that it's reversible. So that means that if you know two polygons are congruent, you could say all of their parts are congruent, but vice versa is also true. If you know all of their parts are congruent, then you could conclude that the polygons are congruent. All right, so let's practice this here. If all of the corresponding parts of these two quadrilaterals are congruent, we can list them as congruent statements. So this congruent statement they give us, Hij, that's right here, Hij, that's congruent to LMNO. Well, the order that they wrote that in, if it's a congruent statement, order matters, remember. So I know just by looking at this statement that H is in the first position and L is in the first position. So I know that angle H must be congruent to angle L. And keep going. I is in the second position, M is in the second position. So angle I is congruent to angle M, etc. You could keep going with those angles. I want you to finish that on your own. When you're talking about sides, HI are the first two letters, congruent to LM, because those are the first two letters. If we look at our diagram, HI congruent to LM, that makes sense. That's like the longest side in both of those diagrams. So you actually can use the diagram. That would help you if, you can tell J is the biggest angle, right? And N is the biggest angle. So J and N are going to correspond with each other and be congruent to each other. But also if you look in the congruent statement, third letter, so you know they have to be corresponding and therefore congruent. All right, you finished listing the angles inside. Okay, so the last angle we hadn't done yet was K congruent to O. That was the last letter in each of those statements there. And then the sides might be a little bit trickier. You got to make sure you take two at a time, right? So Ij are the second two, Mn are the second two, so they're congruent. Remember, when you get to the end, K, you got to go back to H, because in your diagram, KH is one of the sides. So KH is going to be congruent to OL in that order. Remember, order matters. Now, you might have said HK congruent to, but it would have to be LO. So that's fine too. It just, you have to make sure you have the corresponding order. Okay, good. If you look at the other side, when we're talking about congruent triangles, it's just the same as any other polygon. All of the parts are going to be congruent. We're breaking down triangles here because, like I said, the next few lessons are going to be all about congruent triangles. So we want to kind of focus on what happens with congruent triangles and congruent statements. So in this one, they don't even give us a diagram. This is the symbol for triangle, don't forget, right? So the angles are going to be angle W congruent to angle M, angle Y congruent to, what would it be? Angle K, good, and angle S congruent to angle V. And then the sides, you would have WY, first two letters goes with first two letters. So WY congruent to MK. Second two letters, YS congruent to KV. And then first to last, WS congruent to MV. And again, you could have done SW to VM. All right, good. Now, if we're talking about triangles, we're talking about 3 pairs of congruent angles and 3 pairs of congruent sides. So there's really 6 pairs of corresponding parts. When we look at this little practice here, we're talking about writing the congruent statement. Remember, order matters. So number 1 here, they're telling us that these two triangles are congruent. So if we're using L, N, M in that order, what corresponds with L? It would be P. What corresponds with the second one, N? That would be R. And then the last one is M. That corresponds with Q. So you got to make sure you put it in that order. And then you're going to list the corresponding parts. If the measure of angle P here is 90 degrees, and we know it corresponds with angle 1, then how many degrees is angle 1? Well, that has to be 90 degrees also, because congruent angles means they're going to have the same measure. Okay, so that's the idea for the rest of these. Do these on your own, and then pause the video. We'll pause the video now, do them on your own, and then come back and check your answers. Okay, just check your answers here. Make sure they make sense to you. And that's it. Just 2 things to take away. All the corresponding parts are congruent when you have congruent polygons, congruent angles, and congruent sides. Those are the corresponding parts. And order matters. When you are writing a congruent statement, you have to make sure you put them in the corresponding order. Okay, see you tomorrow.